Okay, we're going to get started. Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar on voting rights in New York. My name is Scott Richman and I am the New York, New Jersey Director for ADL. Put simply, democracy depends on ensuring that every voter has an equal and fair opportunity to cast a ballot. There is perhaps no more fundamental right in a democracy than the right to vote. This has always been true, but in the time of COVID-19, when you quite literally may need to put your health in jeopardy in order to vote, it is the job of all of us to ensure access to the ballot box, which could not be more critical. Since 1913, ADL has made a commitment to securing justice and fair treatment for all, which includes freeing our election process from restrictions that have a discriminatory impact. ADL has been speaking out about voting rights since as early as 1965, when Blacks felt disenfranchised, and we have been speaking out ever since. This November's elections are particularly vulnerable. The pandemic underscores and amplifies long existing inequities disproportionately affecting Black and brown people, extremists online, and those extremists seek to manipulate and exploit fear and anger. It also amplifies conspiracy theories about voter fraud, which have been surging. This is all exacerbated by the particularly polarized time in which we live. We will have much more to say about this on today's webinar. I want to thank my incredible staff who put this program together, particularly the regional operations team of Alex Rosenberg, Rachel Grinspan, and Oriana Capone, and the development team of Aaron Kuchar, Jennifer Wang, and others. Thank you also to my colleague, Karen Levit, for moderating this panel. It does take a village to put on something like this. Before we get to the panel, please note that ADL is a 501c3 and is therefore a non-partisan organization that does not support or oppose any candidate for office. Our role is to condemn and to condemn hate, and to call for fair treatment no matter which side of the aisle the candidate sits. ADL is not alone in this battle. We have actively engaged with partner organizations on ways to ensure equal and fair access to the ballot, especially the Let New York Vote Coalition. We are thankful to the coalition for their great work and collaborative spirit among all stakeholders in New York and continue to fight they continue to fight for access to the ballot box and to improve voting rights for all New Yorkers. This brings us to today's webinar with some of the great partner organizations with whom we work. I'm really excited to hear from them, and I know that we will all learn a great deal and can share that with others. We will also be sharing links as we go along to voting resources that will be in the chat. There will be time at the end for Q&A. Please put your questions in the chat box at any time as we go along, and we will do our best to get to them. With that, I want to turn the floor over to Adam Waldman. He is a board member of ADL New York and New Jersey and the chair of the Advocacy and Community Engagement Committee. He will introduce our panelists. Adam?
Great, thanks, Scott. And again, good afternoon. I'm Adam Waldman. I'm an ADL New York, New Jersey regional board member, and as Scott said, the chair of our Advocacy and Community Engagement Committee. I'm very excited to be here to take part in this incredibly important conversation about voting rights in New York and access to the ballot for all. And I'm thrilled to introduce our fantastic panelists joining us this hour. To start, we have Susan Lerner, Executive Director of Common Cause New York, Melody Lopez, Executive Director of the New York Civic Engagement Table, and Jarret Berg, attorney and co-founder of the nonpartisan organization Vote Early New York. And moderating our conversation today is Karen Levit, ADL's National Policy Counsel. So with that, I will turn it over to Karen. Karen, over to you.
Thank you. National Civil Rights Council, actually, but that's our National Policy Council. Lauren is also fantastic. So let's jump right into it and start with some background. Susan, could you please give us some historical and legal context for understanding the voting rights issues that we're facing today and also the history of Black people being disenfranchised in this country?
Sure. So the history of voting in the United States is a history of 2 steps forward and 1 step back throughout our history. When our republic was founded, it was only white property owners who were male who could vote. Over the next century, that expanded to include all males, and after the Civil War, it expanded to include African-American males, but women did not get the franchise until 1920. And after the Civil War, we saw a tremendous energy in the African-American community to be engaged and to vote. That was clamped down by the Jim Crow laws throughout the southern part of the United States, really making it impossible for Black people to be able to vote. And that continued all the way through, as we know, into the 20th century. Women got the right to vote, but Black people were still struggling. Their civil rights were really impeded with really horrific voter suppression. People aren't aware of the fact that the history of voter registration in our country is a very checkered one. People think voter registration is about an orderly election, but it's an idea that was actually invented in the mid-19th century in New York and Pennsylvania to be sure that those dirty Germans and Irish who were coming in as immigrants to our country were unable to vote, and that was making it very hard. We have a history in this country of trying to narrow the access to the franchise so that only some people are able to vote and not others. In New York, in the early 20th century, in order to register to vote, you had to register in one location on one day out of the calendar year, and on occasion that day would fall on Yom Kippur, which tells you who the registration system was trying to discourage from voting. An expansion after the women began to vote and through the Second World War. But nonetheless, the voting rights of African-American Black people were significantly restricted until the 1950s and the 1960s, with the explosion of the Civil Rights Movement, the Voting Rights Act, and a significant expansion in the ability of all people from diverse backgrounds and ethnicities to be able to vote. But as so often is the case in our country, we then saw a narrowing yet again with voter suppression. In the late 1990s and the early part of this century, we saw an expansion of voting access reforms. We saw early voting, which was broadly adopted. We saw broad, nonpartisan, no-fault absentee voting. We saw many places adopt same-day voter registration. Reforms which make it much more accessible for a larger number of eligible voters to be able to vote. Now what we're seeing around the country is the contraction, an attempt to limit early voting, an attempt to do away with same-day registration, an attempt to confuse people about the safety of voting by mail, absentee, or by mail, and the development of pernicious attempts to suppress the vote, like very particular and narrow voter ID requirements and large wholesale purges of voters improperly purged off the voting rolls. So right now, unfortunately, we seem to be in one of those periods of contraction, and we are all fighting against that contraction to go back to the expansion that I believe Americans expect in voting rights, that all eligible voters should have access to safe and secure elections, which are votes which are accurately counted.
So just before we move on to the next question, in a couple of sentences, could you let us know what changes in the Voting Rights Act may have impacted where we are?
Sure. The Voting Rights Act was basically hollowed out by the US Supreme Court in 2013 by a decision called Shelby County. versus Holder, and it basically was very clever in terms of how it hollowed out the Voting Rights Act. It didn't disqualify people. It didn't find the voting rights unconstitutional. It just said that the standards by which a jurisdiction was determined to be under the supervision of the Voting Rights Act was unconstitutional because it was too old, ignoring the fact that there was a voluminous record of continued disenfranchisement of Black and brown voters, voters who needed English assistance throughout the country, and particularly in the jurisdictions that engendered the Voting Rights Act passage in the first place. So that there's no longer direct Department of Justice supervision of changes that are made to voting and to redistricting. And as a consequence, what we have seen is an explosion of voter suppression measures across the country now, particularly in the South, but in other locations as well, like Kansas, where, like mushrooms, this bad policy of trying to suppress the vote to choose who would have the right to vote, and that it would be some people and not others, has proliferated because of a lack of direct supervision by the Department of Justice as a result of the Shelby decision.
Thank you, Susan. For all of the panelists, what concerns do you have based on what you're actually seeing on the ground this year? Let's start with, Jarret.
So I think, you know, I always start this conversation from a human rights perspective. We know that in an emergency, human rights can be squeezed. In fact, all over the globe, they tend to be squeezed when there's a state of emergency declared, especially of perpetual duration. And even when we're in a scenario where the emergency is genuine, and of course this emergency is genuine, the question for civil rights folks is always, do the access and safeguards to our civil rights keep up with the restraints put in place by the emergency? I'm pleased to say that in New York, we've done a pretty good job. Our leadership has done a pretty decent job all year of ensuring that the resiliency measures for voter access are put in place to keep up with the emergency. But as my colleagues here know, New York got a late start to the voting reform game, so to speak. We only started modernizing our election law at the beginning of last year. And so a lot of the expansion that we've seen in New York, which is mostly to keep pace with what's gone on in other parts of the country, whether it's allowing folks to vote remotely, to vote by mail without needing some kind of statutory reason to do so, or to create a reasonable election period for people to exercise their fundamental rights. We are basically testing these out in going into this presidential election, the biggest turnout year of the cycle, at least for the first time on the vote by mail side, and only the second general election on the early voting side. So my concern is that with all this new information and many untested processes, that the voters that are most marginalized and maybe the least frequent voters, the folks that might not even know that there are now 3 ways to vote, that they don't hear about those options, that there's tons of misinformation out there, and that we can't get people the information they need to make informed choices.
Melody, did you want to add to that, or Susan?
I would just
my biggest, go ahead, Melody, please.
Sorry.
First.
Oh, no, sorry about that. Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with everything that Jarret said, and I think it's, especially as, you know, to his point around marginalized communities, folks who are, you know, new citizens, folks who are newer to the participant, you know, folks who are less likely to vote, who, at least for a lot of the, you know, organizations that we work with, we're, you know, actively encouraging to engage in the process, can be especially intimidated and feel that this isn't accessible. In addition to just folks who are regular likely voters, and this is all new to everyone. So I just, you know, wanted to emphasize that, you know, there's sort of an even deeper challenge with communities that aren't going to be traditionally reached by candidate campaigns, who are also out there doing partisan work. So it's really incumbent upon us who are doing this nonpartisan voter education to really reach the folks who are not typically communicated with by traditional campaigns.
I would echo what both Jarret and Melody have said, but frankly, my biggest fear is voters will not vote. That there is so much misinformation, and with new information, some who are not likely voters or who were thinking maybe they would vote because it's an important election will look at all of the barrage coming at them, the misinformation that is coming deliberately from the White House and from one particular political party. And that is true from a nonpartisan point of view. There's a huge amount of misinformation which is being put out there. And as a consequence, I'm afraid the voters will be discouraged, and that the hard work that's been done to reach out to communities of color, to reach out to younger voters, to reach out to unmarried women, all of whom are episodic voters at best, that they will just simply turn off and not participate, and that would be a tragedy.
So in thinking about misinformation, thinking about changes in voting, thinking about reaching out to marginalized communities, Melody, what's being done to address these concerns institutionally, and also what can the average voter do?
Well, so just as, it's pretty heady, but I think there are, for institutionally, I mean, I think that as to the point that, Jarret was making around how this is, and Susan, how this is an all very new process. And even last year with early voting, it was a very small, like relatively smaller elections. It was not a presidential year. And so this is just a whole new level of challenge for all of the institutions that administer our elections. The local board of elections across the state this is frankly probably the largest engineering challenge that they've ever had to do in a generation, in terms of the massive expansion of access to absentee ballots and providing them to voters, ensuring that they make it back to them in time, and that voters understand how to vote. And so I think they are, and there are challenges in terms of them being effectively resourced in order to do that work of administering these elections. And but there are, they've learned a lot of lessons from the primary earlier this year, in terms of how to make it more accessible, how to help ensure that voters understand. I mean, I think a great example is the addition of drop boxes for ballots. I think is a direct response to some of the challenges of administering the election this year. And so they are making an effort as administrators and folks who this already we're going to be immensely challenged without the global pandemic, and outside of our lives, even just administering all of these new reforms that are just only a year and a half old, and so that was already going to be an immense challenge. And combining that with the externalities of people's fear around global health crisis, also misinformation that folks are contending with, and the political environment, I think they are trying their best to make it more accessible. And I know that my colleagues can speak more to that as well. But one thing I did want to also mention is that given the environment and voters feeling potentially disheartened or concerned or fearful of going out to the polls, or in the cases where they may want to do that, if they cannot for various reasons be able to vote absentee, there are things that you can do. And I think it's important to ensure that voters understand that they are empowered, and have, understand that their rights when they do go to an early voting site or to vote on election day, if that's what they choose to do. And if they do see something that they're uncomfortable with, that they have the right to inform workers or poll watchers, which I know Susan can talk a great deal about, the amazing program that the Common Cause is putting together, and alert folks at the poll site to what's happening. Also call hotline, which I hopefully will be part of the resources shared with folks today, at 866-OUR-VOTE. where they can report what's happened, and also really important to document every detail about what happened, including the time, the location, and all of those details, and then ensuring that voters know that they are empowered to do that if they feel when they are participating that they are seeing something that's not right, that they don't feel comfortable with. And I think it is about feeling, giving them that power back as voters, and that knowing that they do have rights when they do participate. So it's a combination of supporting good administration practices and ensuring that voters know that they do have rights when they do participate.
Karen, I think your question, what can the average voter do? In addition to what Melody was talking about, which is if you see something wrong, there are various ways in which you can report it. I think more basically, an informed voter should make it their business to be sure that their family and friends, and even people that they are interacting with casually, know that there are 3 ways to vote, know how they can get an absentee ballot, know that they can vote early. By sharing that information with family and friends, being sure that family and friends have a voting plan. If you're planning to vote early on a Tuesday afternoon, call your mother, call your sister, call a friend and say, hey, I'm planning to go during lunch to early vote. Why don't you come with me? And also, I think here in New York, people need to know that you can help people who have received absentee ballots by taking their absentee ballot and dropping it off in one of the drop boxes that is at every early voting location and every election day polling place, as well as every Board of Election office. So if you have an elderly friend or neighbor, well, be neighborly. Ask them, did you get an absentee ballot? Would you like me to take it in for you so you're sure that the Board of Elections receives it? You can do that. There's no limit to that. Elderly friends, just people that you know are not leaving home frequently. You can arrange that they will fill out their absentee ballot, put it in the envelope, sign and date that envelope, and you can say, I'm going to be outside your door at 1:15 before I head for early voting. I'll knock on your door. You can just push the envelope under the door to me, and I will deliver it. You won't have to worry about a stamp, and you won't have to worry, did they get it? You will know that they got it. So there are a lot of ways in which voters can help other voters right now, and we want people to be proactive in helping everybody they know make a voting plan and vote successfully.
And I think that's great advice on both fronts. Looking at the calendar right now, a concern I have is that New York has not reformed its 25-day registration deadline. So we are in a scenario where there's an exciting debate scheduled this week. It might bring a whole bunch of new people into the process. They will have less than 48 hours to get registered to vote. So one thing that we're encouraging that builds off Susan's fine points about folks who tune into ADL webinars about voting several weeks before that can help amplify this message. Good civic hygiene, right? Right now, folks should be checking to make sure that their own registration is exactly how they expect it to be. Their address, their name, you're looking for it to say active for your registration. We still have a largely manual process in New York when it comes to registration. And so there are anomalies. There are errors that happen. New Yorkers tend to move a lot and certain folks move a lot more than others. And we have a residency-based registration system. So now is the time to identify those little things. And there's a lot of issues that happen around elections that aren't intentional or that fall somewhere between sloppiness and negligence and just inadvertent things that happen when you're dealing with millions of people and tons of data and a decentralized system across, like we have in New York, 58 local boards of elections. So now is a perfect time to make sure your registration is in check. Encourage your loved ones to do the same. I'm very concerned. We don't exactly know what's going to happen with the presidential debate schedule, but there are all these inflection points where new folks tune into the process, particularly people that don't follow the ins and outs of the political cycle, the news cycle, the way some of us might. And after the registration deadlines in New York, these things are unforgiving, and we start to lose the access that we fought so hard for. So this is a key week for that, and making sure people know their options well ahead of time. We also want people to avoid those postmark deadlines that you might have read about in the spring and the summer, And that can be done if people act right now. We really don't want people to wait until the deadline for requesting absentee ballots, for example, so the 27th of October, and then test out how good the safety net is to protect their rights.
So I want to make sure we get through all of the incredibly important information we need to get through. Susan, what are the different options for voting in New York this year?
So as Jarret mentioned, now in New York, we have 3 ways to vote this year. Anybody who is concerned about becoming sick with COVID or making somebody else sick has the right to get an absentee ballot by requesting it and using temporary illness as their reason for getting an absentee ballot. So absentee balloting is available to just about everybody in our state. This year, as Melanie pointed out, we have the first presidential election where we have early voting. So from Saturday, October 24th through to the following Sunday, November 1st, you can go in person. You can avoid the crowds that we're expecting on election day, but vote in person early and know that you have filled out your ballot and put it in the scanner yourself. And of course, we all have the right to vote on election day, November 3rd, where the polls are open from 6 a.m. in the morning till 9 p.m. in the evening. And it's also important for people to know that New York is one of the very few states where even if you request or even return your absentee ballot and you want to vote in person, you can still go and vote in person. And your in-person vote will invalidate and override your absentee. So in New York, you always have the ability and the right to vote in person, even if you requested or sent back your absentee ballot. So 3 ways to vote. The important thing is make your voting plan now.
And Jarret, what are the big changes this year or in the past year and a half that you made reference to?
So Susan mentioned the top line, of course, and that's incredibly important. Voting this year will look a lot different to folks who haven't voted since 2018 or prior. And it's important that people really think about these options. We think, my approach is if you can wear a mask, if you've internalized some of the things that we've lived through over the past 6 months, if you can visit a supermarket once a week, once every 2 weeks, really consider voting early in person, finding a quiet time during either of those 2 weekends over the 9 days. Every jurisdiction, every county and the city of New York must have at least 60 hours additionally on top of what's been there on election day. And that's a massive expansion of time. And this all made sense before anyone had ever heard of COVID-19. This concept of spreading out turnout over many days, giving people more time, giving administrators more time to deal with some of the small hiccups that can really create larger problems when people go to vote. So we definitely want people to consider those options. And if you're not in your jurisdiction, you can't wear a mask, certainly you could vote remotely, vote by mail. It was mentioned earlier, you can return those mail ballots to any early voting site or election day site or the Board of Elections office in your locality. So that's across the 5 boroughs. For early voting, this is brand new for New York. Outside of New York City, voters can go to any early voting site in their county. So that means 17 sites in Westchester. It means 15 sites in Nassau County where they have 83 hours of early voting. That's a dramatic expansion of our access. And so avoid election day, where in the presidential year, we know that there are going to be long lines, 30 minutes or more in 4 or 5 boroughs. It's just the nature of having so many people vote in that system. To mention a couple others very quickly, folks will encounter, if they go to vote in person, electronic poll books. It's a fancy way of saying an iPad. Some people might not have checked in that way before. It's just for the check-in process, but we want people to expect to see that. It actually allows them to process voters much more quickly and reconcile the system. So it's a more secure system, but people will have to sign in with a stylus. This is not like going to the grocery store. Please sign legibly. That's how we identify you in New York. So you won't be asked for ID, but you will be asked to sign in, and that's an important thing. Also, there's a lot of questions out there. I get this one a lot. Early voting, going during that 9-day period, is akin to voting on election day. So you will get your ballot, you'll mark it privately, you'll scan it on a machine right then and there. And in that case, your vote will be counted and included in the election night totals. So we get that question a lot. The law varies in 50 states, but that's how we do it here in New York. The last two big changes I think are just worth mentioning that'll be in effect this year. They're not really front-facing, but we now have pre-registration in New York, which means that 16 and 17-year-olds can register. That was a big change that was fought for by a lot of groups, and that's now in place. And we have registration portability. So as folks move around the state, we should be retaining a lot more registrations, and ultimately, if people don't update their registration, and so they show up at their correct poll site and they're not found in the book, they should make sure to request an affidavit ballot. They should be offered one, but unfortunately, sometimes poll workers forget to tell people about that. But that's your fail-safe ballot, right? If you're a voter, you've moved recently, we never send somebody home and say, try again in 4 years. That's not what we do anywhere. It's not what we should be doing. So that's an exciting change that will save a lot more ballots on the back end of the process. But of course, we want people to know the registration deadline, update their information now.
Great, thank you. Melody, so we've talked a bit about these different types of voting and what the big changes are. What are the pros and cons of each type of absentee voting this year?
So I think it's really dependent on your own individual circumstances to a great extent, right? And you know, as Susan mentioned and Jarret have mentioned as well, like the key message is that there are these 3 ways to vote, and making that plan based on your individual circumstances is really key. And you know, as others have said, you know, early voting has the benefit of there being many more hours to access the voting location. You know, also weekend hours, which for many individuals who are working during the the weekdays, being able to go on the weekend is incredibly helpful. Also, just having sites that are open so many hours, enabling hopefully greater social distancing at those locations during the early voting period, is also another benefit to voting early. And then also just the experience of, as Jarret described, of like, hey, you get to go in and mark your ballot and see it be, inputted into the machine and be able to have that experience as a voter, and be able to do that in a way where you're probably not going to have to wait online, and be able to have that space and the flexibility of various locations, and being able to go to different locations outside of New York City that are in your county. So it doesn't have to be, you're not assigned to any specific location amongst the voting sites that are available to you. So there's, those are the benefits of early voting almost under any circumstance, right? Having that flexibility as an individual to participate in person. And also I think one other thing worth mentioning is that both in-person options, either on election day or early voting, I think for folks who are non-English speaking, folks who are who are individuals with disabilities, who may not find an absentee ballot accessible, may need to go in person in order to vote in the election. And so having that opportunity to go at various times will be really helpful for all of those communities. And then of course the access to absentee ballot, if you're unable to go in person, this massive expansion is really a great way to participate. And if you are unable to leave your home or don't feel comfortable going to a voting location in person, the absentee ballot is a really great option for you. And of course, there's always election day, and polls open at 6 a.m. And if you're someone who's like, I've always voted at this one poll site at 6 a.m. every election day, you can still do that. And that's it's just now there's just more options, and so it's just much more friendly for voters in terms of having access and participation up to and including election day. And so I think the key thing is there are benefits and to all of them, and it's really incredibly dependent on your individual circumstances, and why making that plan will be essential for ensuring that folks are able to participate and feel that the elections will be accessible to them.
Jarret, can you expand on that a little bit, specifically for the vote by mail option, and whether there's a difference if people mail in their ballot versus putting it in a drop box. You had mentioned that as one of the changes.
Absolutely. So the first part is, and this is brand new, and we had to work to get this in place for this year. People can request their ballots if they choose to vote remotely. They can do that online or by phone. There's a link that I hope someone can put in the chat. If not, I will. That allows people to request their ballot in seconds. It could take, you know, a minute, not even, to request your mail ballot. So that eliminates one leg of the snail mail. New York City now has a tracking system. A few other counties do. It is better than it was in the past when we had no way to track ballots. But that's just one sort of piece of due process that we're trying to build into the system. And I also mentioned you could request it by phone. If that's an option for you as well. I think on this concept of, you know, which one should you gravitate toward, there's not a difference between returning your ballot any which way with regard to how it's counted. But if you return it to a drop box at any early voting site, and according to the governor's executive order, these have to be located by the entrance. They have to be set up in such a way that a voter wouldn't have to wait online and go through the process. So the goal is to make it completely contactless. That's a great way to eliminate another leg of snail mail and not have to deal with that uncertainty. But mail ballots, remote ballots are processed after the election. And so I just want to put out there is no reason for anyone to wait till election day to vote. Yes, you can. Yes, it is your right. And we're thrilled that there are now 3 ways to vote. But the way I look at this, if you wait until that point in the process, now everything has to go perfectly right for you. There will be lines at 6 in the morning. This is really an exciting time. Oddly, on election day, we see lines at 6, and then by 8 a.m. it tends to be quiet. But why leave it to chance? Why put yourself in a situation where now you don't really know, is there going to be a line and what you're going to encounter? So there's always tons of excitement. I would encourage folks, take action now. Early action protects your rights. Get your voting out of the way so you can help others. That frees up your election day to make phone calls, knock doors, nonpartisan, partisan, whatever you do. But there's no reason now that we have so much more time and so many more options to sort of wait until all those other options have expired.
And also, election day is the deadline for voting. That's not necessarily the day that we're going to be getting election results, particularly with so much vote by mail going on. That's when things are going to start getting counted. But, you know, like Jarret just said, that's, you know, we have so much time leading up. Well, not as much time as we'd like, but we have time leading up to that when people can, you know, start this process and get their ballots in. But Jarret, could you just answer a couple of follow-up questions about how ballot tracking works, just to clarify for people? So does it track one way, like when the ballot is sent out to you, or the other way when you send the ballot back, or both ways? Because this is new, so can you just explain in a little more detail?
It is new. And I've had concerns, our coalition has had concerns this year about what due process is in place for this method, which has not been mainstream until right now. The state has added a bunch over the summer, so there's far more due process there today than there was on both the front end and the tracking, as well as what happens to your ballot after the fact. But we do not have a statewide beautiful system that I would describe as cradle to the grave, right? From the minute your request goes in until the end of that process, like some of the states that have been using this voting option for years and years, maybe a decade do. So there's workflow tracker type tracking. So you make your request, they do give you a reference number now. So you should print that page, save that page. New York City does have a ballot tracking tool that allows you to go in there and it shows your application's been received, it's been approved. We believe there's mail tracking in there, but it doesn't seem to be instantaneous. And so it's spotty. That is the right way to think about this. It's spotty. There is no perfect way to vote. That's why I say early action protects your rights. But you will get that reference number, and every couple days you're welcome to check the tracker, follow up with your Board of Elections. Outside of the city, it's very piecemeal. We know Onondaga County has a workflow tracker and that sort of thing. That the counties are required to tell the state where they're at in terms of processing their backlog. But there's not a ton in place to ensure that the bureaucracy of the post office is working and being good partners with the bureaucracy of the Board of Elections. So I just put out there, right? Things do get lost in the mail. Early action is important.
But, you know, I think Jarret is really downplaying the value of the absentee ballot tracker, which is a significant advance, which means that you can verify that your absentee ballot request has been received. You were not able to do that previously. You can verify that your absentee ballot has been mailed to you. So if you don't get it within a 7 to 10 day time period, even if the mail tracking hasn't shown up, you know that something's gone wrong. And when you mail it back, you're able to verify that the board has received it. So I think this is, you know, something which New York City residents who have requested absentee ballots can really benefit from, because it is information that was not available previously. You had to call, you had to wait. Hopefully the person who answered the phone was going to take the time to look up your records. Now you get nervous at 2 in the morning, you can hop out of bed, get on the computer and check, did my absentee ballot get mailed? Did my absentee ballot get back to the Board of Elections? I think it's a big advance, and I don't want to downplay it. I'm sure, you know, it's not perfect, and I'd like to see a robust system throughout the state, but considering that we had virtually no absentee balloting, you know, this past March, this has been a huge explosion. And unlike states that have had decades, literally decades, to prepare for vote by mail or absentee voting, New York is playing a very quick, underfunded game of catch up. And at least here in New York City, we have this ability to check.
So we've walked people through, generally speaking, you know, here are your different options, here's what you need to know. But for all of our panelists, have you seen voter suppression tactics having a disproportionate impact in marginalized communities?
So there actually was a robocall which went out last month to a number of different states, including, I understand, some African-American communities in New York, where the robocall, and it's believed they know who sent it out, and those 2 people have been indicted in Michigan. And the robocall basically tells people that they shouldn't rely on vote by mail because you could be targeted by the police, debt collectors, or a CDC vaccination program. It literally says, don't be finessed by giving your private information to the man. Stay safe and beware of vote by mail. So we know that there are nefarious forces out there. They're working overtime to try and keep people from voting. And we are all trying as hard as we can. And we're grateful to ADL for helping us get accurate information out to as many people as possible. That's why we at Common Cause, as part of our election protection program, are going to be doing text banking into minority communities. And Melody's nodding her head because I know that a lot of the groups for New York Civic Engagement Table are going to be doing a lot of GOTV to traditionally marginalized communities as we get closer to the election, to be sure that they know how to access voting. Melody, do you want to talk about some of the programs that our partners have?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, and I would also add, just to the general question about you know, suppression. I mean, I think in addition to these very overt proactive attempts, there's just the basic environment that we're swimming in right now. That
how difficult it is to figure it out.
Yeah, absolutely. And
that's suppression.
You know, yeah, it is. And when we have national leadership that is calling into question on a regular basis, one of the, you know, key ways of accessing the ballot, that is a you know, very proactive attempt at suppression as well. And so I think, you know, there's all these dog whistles and just lots of concern around this, the environment and the polarization and how that's being weaponized to make people feel you know, unwilling to or unsafe participating. But yes, absolutely. You know, we work with many organizations that are, you know, based in and led by, you know, communities of color and places across the state of New York. And, of course, certainly the challenge of not being able to do traditional, door-to-door canvassing or in-person events that we've been grappling with since earlier this year has been made what the programs look like a little different. But certainly doing a lot of texting to folks across the state. I mean, so far this year, we've already texted almost over 2 million people for various things like the primary election, but also the census, which is a whole other ball of wax too. Not the topic for today, but could be a topic for another very long conversation. And so being able to, be folks who are accountable to and from the community, being those messengers to dispel misinformation, to provide accurate information is really, really critical. So yes, folks are, running remote phone banks, text banks, using social media, really just kind of encouraging their communities and the folks that they have built relationships with over the years. We have a base of over 1 million folks who have been identified by the groups that we work with as supportive of the issues that they work on and members of the various organizations that we work with. And so it'll be really critical for all of these groups to play this essential role as being trusted messengers around civic engagement broadly, and being able to spread this message around the 3 ways to vote, that it is functional, their vote will count, that despite the challenges, that they will be able to, that, believe it or not, that in the state of New York, there are more ways to vote and it is more accessible than it's ever been, despite what's happening externally. And I think that's really the key message that a lot of folks will be delivering to their communities.
If I can add just some of the stuff we've seen, I'm so glad Melody mentioned the census. It is a different topic. That deadline was extended, but the same kind of intimidation and fear mongering that we saw around that's directed at causing an undercount is the sort of thing that we see around elections. Susan mentioned the robocall, and we did get a few reports of that a few months ago. The other thing, college students, it really doesn't get enough play, but SUNY Stony Brook a year ago in Suffolk County, those students had a right to vote early too, but it took the Democracy Club on campus there 3+ hours to get to their early voting site, one direction. So, there's a question of access. We can sort of fight for rights, but the way these things play out locally can cause suppression too. And so it is important that people look at their options and really think about that ahead of time. Otherwise, through no fault of your own, other than just assuming that the system that's there is a good one that makes a lot of sense in your community, we shouldn't assume those things. We should check now and empower ourselves and our families.
I'm actually going to take the moderator's prerogative here. I looked it up, and the Census Bureau has declared that today is the last day that they will be doing the census despite the court order. So if you have not filled out your census, please do it now. We will be dropping that link in the chat box. Please, please, please fill out your census. That is a nonpartisan message, so I will reiterate it again. The moderator's prerogative. I don't care. Fill out your census. Okay, moving on. We do have a few minutes left. If folks want to drop a question in the chat box, feel free. Otherwise, I'm just going to keep asking the questions I want to ask, which is also fine. Okay, we're good. So actually, thank you so much, Alex, also for dropping that census link. Let's go with the natural question, which is, how is the census related to voting? Because these things are actually connected.
Well, the census really governs ultimately who you are going to be able to vote for, because the census is used to set political boundary lines. So your district for Congress, your district for the Assembly, your district for the Senate could shift. You can find yourself in a different district depending on the results of the census. We know that New York State has lost population, and one of our concerns is that if not enough people fill out the census, we will lose not one, but 2 congressional districts, which means there's going to be a big fight over where the districts are going to be redrawn to reduce the number of representatives that we have in Congress. That has consequences for funding, that has consequences for programs. I mean, it has just huge consequences, but it certainly has an impact on who you get to vote for and how strong our delegation is in Congress.
Sorry about that. My mic stopped working. Thank you. And for each of you, if there are just 1 or 2 things that you would like our attendees today to take away from our conversation, what would those be? And let's go with Susan, Jarret, and Melody in that order.
Don't wait. That's our basic message. Avoid the crowds. Make your voting plan now. If you're going to vote absentee, get your absentee ballot. Don't sit on it. Make your choices. Get it back to the Board of Elections promptly. If you want to vote early, have your plan. When are you going to do that? Weekend? During the week? In an evening? Are you going to vote with somebody? And the same thing for Election Day. The most important thing is to make your choice about how you're going to vote and have your plan in place and not wait and run any of the deadlines.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. If you can wear a mask, consider voting early in person. There are 3 options here, and we do need to learn about them. But October 24th to November 1st, 9 additional days, at least 60 hours. That is a massive, massive expansion of your rights. But if you wait until it's over, then that's not an option for you. So think about those now, put it on your calendar, and that's our recommendation.
Yes, echoing both Susan and Jarret's point that participate, first of all, and you have the wonderful option of doing it early, which is frankly just around the corner. Like it's already October 1st. I know, it's a little scary, but it's coming up very soon. So the opportunity is right here. And in addition to making your own plan, as Susan mentioned earlier, encourage your family, your friends, your neighbors, kind of back to my point that a lot of the groups that we're working with who are spreading this message to the folks that they have relationships with. You as individuals in your community also have the power to do that, to spread this message to the people that you know and that you have relationships with. Since you spent this hour with us this afternoon and you've been empowered with all of this great information about how voting in New York State's working this year, I would definitely friendly request that you share this information as widely with your networks as you can.
And I'd like to talk a little bit about ways in which the folks can actually help around early voting and Election Day. And that is, as Melody mentioned briefly, Common Cause is the national leader for the field program for election protection. And election protection is the nationwide program that runs the 1-866 Our Vote hotline. But the field program actually places people out in the field. This year, it's going to be a lot of people roving in New York City on bikes and in cars outside of New York City, as well as if you are willing to be assigned to a specific polling place to monitor outside the polling place. And this is really volunteers tell us one of the most satisfying things that they do, which is to help people actually directly vote and to identify problems at polling places, report them back to the 1-866 Our Vote hotline and to our command center so we can get the problem solved directly by the Board of Elections. So people are able to volunteer as rovers, as in-place monitors, and this year for the first time, we're also monitoring social media for disinformation, misinformation, and just to answer questions, as well as to look for problems. So anybody who's interested can sign up at protectthevote.net and we will be in touch with you and deploy you productively to help people vote and to be sure that any attempts at voter suppression are nipped in the bud.
Fantastic, thank you. We're unfortunately out of time and we do have to wrap up, although we could keep this going for another hour easily. Thank you again to our amazing panelists for sharing your time and your knowledge with us. To the folks who have stuck with us, please remember to make sure that you're registered to vote if you're eligible, and to make a voting plan and to share that with the people in your life. Also, fill out your census today and remind your friends and family to fill it out today. That's 2020census.gov. That's going to affect who you can vote for in the future. So these things are directly linked. I'm going to turn it over to Scott now for some closing remarks.
So I'm going to thank the person who wasn't thanked, which is Karen Levit. Thank you so much, my amazing colleague who conducted this extremely informative panel. If you like what you heard, certainly you are all ambassadors now and will be charged with bringing this message forward. But if you like what you heard and want to let others know, in New Jersey, we are conducting the exact same panel, although with a group of New Jersey panelists tomorrow at 12 p.m. You can register, or they can register, at ADL New York, New Jersey website, which is nynj.adl.org, nynj.adl.org. And we have many more important events coming up, so you can also sign up there for the mailing list if you're not on it. And don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, and please join the conversation there. Thank you all so much for being on today's Voting Rights webinar, which is now concluded.